First, I'd like to welcome all of our attendees to the Windshire Group's Ask the Expert series, How to Leverage the Digital Revolution in Early Stage Companies, with our special guest from the Court Square Group. My name is Jen Bardsley, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's webinar. I currently serve as the account manager slash operations manager for the Windshire Group. On today's agenda, I'll introduce you to our panelists, and then they are going to go over some common industry concerns through a question and answer forum. And then we can move over to our new audience question and answer. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar. You can use the Q&A icon on your control panel and submit them. If for some reason we run out of time at the end, to get to your question, we will respond to you directly at a later time. And then we'll conclude, and then we'll have our final conclusion of the webinar. So I would like to note that the views expressed in this webinar, those of the panelists, it's for informational purposes only. It's not intended as legal or regulatory advice. And to introduce our panelists, we have Dr. James Blackwell, who's president and principal consultant for the Windshire Group, which was founded in 2011. The Windshire Group accelerates development and manufacturing for commercializing therapies and provides quality expertise. Dr. Blackwell has been a leading industry consultant for more than 15 years. And we also have Keith Parent, who is a founder and CEO of Court Square Group. He leads the company in the vision for using IT as a strategic enabler for life science companies from preclinical all the way to manufacturing. Now I'd like to, it's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Dr. Blackwell, and then we will move over to the common questions.
Thanks, Jen. The session is being recorded and will be available later. So the webinar today really is the marriage of the user requirements for small companies and the marriage of that and the IT structure and organization of the company. It's a very important factor. And why is this important? This is very important for small companies because it's important for them to improve their operational efficiency. People spend less time looking for stuff, and it speeds up your business processes. And you want to facilitate decision-making. You want to be able to access the most current and correct information, and it increases organizational value. A disorganized information with their information all over the place can kill a deal. We've seen that happen. Due diligence and data rooms need to be well designed and populated with good information to facilitate deal making. So that can be very important to small companies. And you're creating very valuable information. And this will be important later for your regulatory filings and for compliance needs, and for your technical people who want to access and understand the history in terms of what's happening within the organization. So this helps you avoid compliance issues later, patient privacy laws, health authority issues, or potentially even SEC violations. And also, it creates a more satisfied workforce. Studies have shown people are happier when they're dealing with environments that are well organized and they're able to work efficiently. Nobody wants to be in a cumbersome, inefficient, time-wasting environment. Next slide, Jen.
Okay, we will, I'll start off with this common question that we get. So question number one. All our documents and data are stored in different places, including people's email. We need to organize and consolidate. How do we consolidate without creating a burden on our scientists and development personnel?
Keith, would you like to start this?
Hey, Jenny, I'm going to jump on this question if you don't mind. And first, I want to thank you, the Windshire Group, for inviting Court Square to be part of this Ask the Expert series. And our goal today, is working with our expertise around managing lots of companies all the way from, the largest pharma companies down to the smallest startup companies. And, we see this illustration that we see in front of us right now talks about a lot of the different things that we see in our client base where people have documents everywhere, and it could be content, it could be Excel spreadsheets, it could be PDF documents, it could be Word documents. People are trying to edit things and sending different versions over. One of the biggest problems that we have is that people can't find anything. We did a project with one client who wanted to put in a governance plan and a governance model for their environment. And one of the problems that they had is that they anticipated and calculated that they lost 40% of their productivity just on trying to find documents. So when you think about that over the course of a company, as you start to grow, it's easy when you only have a couple people and you're sharing one area, whether it's Box or Dropbox or some people have Ignite. There's lots of different tools that are out there. They could have their file share. But the goal is, how do we find documents? How do we make it so that it's efficient for us to work this way? And also, when you start to hire new people coming into an organization, you know, the people in the business side have one way of looking at how their documents are. The people in the lab may have a different way of looking at it. They may be using different applications. Everybody's got a laptop typically, or they've got some other device, and trying to correlate all those documents around an environment becomes a real nightmare. What's the most common way that people do things? James, where have you found some of the biggest things with your clients?
Well, Box, SharePoint, things like that. And to your point, Keith, we helped the client with a BLA filing. They had documents strewn throughout Box. The time wasted people spent looking for things and information to pull that BLA together was horrific.
One of the things, I think, Jenny, if you could hit the next slide, it'd be great.
Sure.
We find so often people use email as the content management system. And I can't stress enough, email is great for doing email. It's a transactional setup for sending documents between people and using things and things that you don't really want to use email as a content management system. It's not meant to do that. It's easy enough to put folders out there. It's easy enough to put rules out there, but you're not doing the proper backups that you should be doing about that. It's easily corrupted. Some people have very large mailboxes. They don't understand about copying those content databases or using that. And particularly if you're going to be talking to regulatory authorities, whether you're getting ready for an IND or you're getting ready for any kind of meetings with a health authority, you want to be able to keep that information elsewhere. So we can't stress enough how not to use email as a content management system. And that could be every bit of content. Some people find that they have issues with sizes of documents that they're going to share or content that they're going to share with each other. If you have large SAS data sets that you're sharing between different groups, you just can't email those around. So our goal would be to say, let's put something in place that will help you to categorize and find documents. There's lots of problems that you have with documents themselves. Some things may be searchable, they may not be searchable. I think that we'll talk later on in the presentation about a couple things. One area is OCRing of documents. OCR stands for optical character recognition. Most people don't realize that when you pull in a document, if it's a scanned in document through a scanner, it's not searchable, because you need to be able to OCR that document and be able to see and find the data that's on that. So, and how you set up your searching and how you do that across those documents is really important to finding those. So I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is say, putting a system in place is a really valuable tool. And it gets right back to a lot of the topics you brought up in that first slide, James. So how about the next question, Jenny?
Keith, so what's important about that OCR is that your PDFs that you submit to regulatory filings, they also have to be OCR'd so that they can be submitted. And you don't want to be doing that at the last minute, which we've seen. So in terms of, to answer the question, in terms of managing information, resources, and content, you really want to keep it simple. Everything we're talking about today can be done simply, even for small companies. You want to create a folder structure and file names with specific taxonomy and a governance plan. Create a steward within your organization, not IT, someone who understands the knowledge and are experts, and who will become the steward and point of authority for your own information systems internally. It could be an external consultant as well. create a means of backups of your data and systems. Don't rely too much on a multitude of cloud systems, and beware of the business risks and compliance to quality manufacturing about having too many cloud suppliers. Have a strategic plan, and this can be very simple for a small company, how to manage and grow your IT systems as the company grows, and have adequate security controls around that. And don't think, I don't have time. IT and knowledge management isn't a priority right now. We're too small to worry about this. If you don't have time now, then when will we do?
To that point, James, I think that, the concept of appointing a steward, that steward could be one person when you're a small company and you have somebody that just is laying out the groundwork for how you do that. But as you grow and as you add more departments within a company, what you might want to do is have a representative from each department, so that you can work together and know how data is going to flow from one area to another. I know that's a common problem that we have, is that some people classify data one way in one department and a different way in a different department. And that it makes, you have to end up doing a mapping exercise later on to kind of reconcile that data across it. So by having some group or a smaller contingent within your company that are helping to lay out the groundwork for that, it helps you in the long run to find data and to categorize your data effectively.
Next question, Jen.
Great. And moving on to question number 2. We are expanding to new facilities, including laboratories and manufacturing. How can we unify our systems and generate actionable business intelligence from data across disparate systems, departments, and locations?
Jen, I'll start with this one. This is actually an example from a client project in the gene and cell therapy space. And so where we started was creating a data hierarchy as part of developing the IT roadmap for them. Data is represented at various levels, starting at the very low levels, which is your very primary data that's created at the source. And then as you go up, you have higher order systems with greater governance. But nevertheless, all these systems are involved with the patient at some level. And so this is what we call a needle to needle process. So even before the sample is drawn from the patient, there's data being generated at the care center, treatment center for this patient that becomes important compliant data that will feed into this system. And so the storage of that sample, shipping, goes on site, gets processed, it's tested, released by QA, then gets shipped back to the patient. Just think of all the data that needs to be compliant that's handled by that. And even post-treatment follow-up becomes data that the organization will need to track. So nevertheless, it starts, all this data, one way is to deal with this that Keith can elaborate on is creating a data lake. And that's where all the data goes. You throw all that data there. That's not a bad thing. You just need a means to find that data, organize that data, and present it to the end users in a way that they can readily use to make decisions and document things from a compliant standpoint.
I think, James, to your point, I think that data lake and gathering all that data where it could be in a central location for everybody to use that for different systems, because different people need, there's a different need for it. If I'm a quality person, I need it for one thing. If I'm somebody in finance, I need it for another. If I'm on the manufacturing floor, then I need it for something else. I think the big part here, this is just illustrating how all the way from the initial time that you talk to a patient all the way through when you get back to that patient, there's so many different people that need the data across the board. We just mentioned the fact that you may have a data steward, or you may have a group that's going to work on naming conventions and how it all works together. Just look at on the right-hand side of this diagram, how many different systems are out there that you may have to work with. And if you look at them across the board, you may find that there's integration aspects of every single one of those. How do we reconcile that? How do we work with that? It's a nightmare if you don't think about that and plan for that. So our goal here is just to talk to you about why do we put these things in place. And in our respect, and I think that James and I both agree on this, you can't start early enough in this process. I think, when you first start, it's hard sometimes for these early stage companies coming out of a lab you're so focused in on just getting the results you need from a scientific perspective that you don't think about the business aspects in the long run. And as you start getting out there and you get funding, you go out and start to do this stuff. You may think, well, we'll get a package and it'll solve this problem. That's not the way it works. I mean, there's lots of interaction across the spectrum of your systems that you're going to have.
And to Keith's point, this slide here is really a process-centric view, but the next slide shows how, for the same project, level 5 was above this. So this is sort of the overarching infrastructure. And so this is in this particular project was Microsoft-centric. This isn't the only solution, obviously. It's just an example. So obviously they're using Office 365, but everyone who subscribes to Office 365 has access to Power Apps, Power BI. This is one means. There are others out there, but this is one means of meeting the requirements that Keith just spoke to for organizations. Next slide.
Well, I think also, James, to your point about the different levels and how they have to interact. By using some of these tools, you'll be able to pull data out of different systems at different levels, and we'll put the appropriate dashboards together for the right audience that's going to look at that data. And I think that's what's really important. At the executive level, they kind of want to see that overview. But when I'm on the factory floor and I need to see detailed, real-time data, we have to be able to give them that capability to be able to see that.
Absolutely. And you can parse those things out in terms of what's compliant GXP type data versus what's business type of data that isn't within the remit of the FDA and health authorities. Any comments on this slide, Keith? I think we've spoken.
Yeah, I think, James, this side, there's a couple of key points in this one. When we talk about metadata and governance models, what is the purpose of doing metadata definition or having governance model? It was for a particular project, but everybody should understand that when we're classifying data or we're using data across multiple systems, there's going to be a way that we want to classify our data, and metadata is a great way of doing that. It could be from the content within the documents that you have, or it could be specifically generated by machinery that's creating some output, or it could be a shipping manifest from something that's coming in or going out to somebody else. That chain of custody, James just talked about that needle to needle. Imagine if you're the patient, you want to make sure that when you give your cells to somebody, you want to make sure it's your cells that you get back into your body. So those are the kind of things that we want to make sure that we're looking. And there's new technologies out there, things like blockchain to help with some of this stuff. You don't need to know the specific about how that all works, but you do need to know that somebody's thinking about that and they're putting it in. And most of that is all for quality or regulatory tracking. The concept of the governance model is really around who's going to access the data. Is it internal departments looking at the data, or is it external? Is it customers or vendors, or is it somebody else that's going to look at it? Is it a regulator that may look at it? So by putting that governance model in place, we're going to give the appropriate security and the access into that data. And I think that's someplace that people may short shift that sometimes and open it up wide to different groups, and all of a sudden realize that, hey, these people really shouldn't be seeing some of this data. So that's where it's important that you have that group internally to your company that can identify, how do we want to lay this out when we start?
Absolutely, Keith. We're working with a client now that's building a facility, and we're already thinking about this and helping them put this into place. Thanks. Next question, Jen.
Sure. So James and Keith, another question is, we are evolving from R&D to clinical and know we need to start working in a qualified environment and use validated applications. How can we start with a simple solution that will grow with our company?
So I'm going to handle this one, James, if you don't mind. The concept of qualified environment, let's just define a couple things for people, because you may or may not know it. If you're an early stage company and you're coming out of a lab, you may have heard the words qualified and validated and have a thought about what they mean. But the reality is, when we look at any system that's out there, you can't have a validated system unless it's in qualified infrastructure or qualified systems, parts of that system. So how do we maintain a qualified environment? A lot of that's through change control. We have to have proper change control, understanding that you have control over your environment. If we're going into a cloud environment, there's public clouds and there's private clouds. How are they maintaining compliance? What is your responsibility in that? Ultimately, you are responsible for your data. Regardless of who your vendors are, you have to understand how you do vendor management. You have to understand how you qualify those vendors and make sure that they've got the right systems in place to deal with that data. And you have to have SOPs around how you're dealing with all of that. You can certainly qualify a public cloud vendor, but you have to know what are the risks around that. And you're going to have risk ratings and things like that around the vendors you work with. All of this can be done. It's understanding how to do that. Most IT firms that you're going to deal with don't understand a lot of that. Once we've qualified both our vendors and our environment, whether it's software or hardware, we can then go to validate the applications. Can you go to the next slide, Jenny? So when we validate, here's some terms you may have heard or are familiar with: IQ, OQ, and PQ. Typically, once we've qualified the infrastructure and the operating systems underneath, we're just saying that we've installed them based on the way the vendors that we're buying those from recommend that they get installed. When we're looking at these specific applications, typically it's based on the user requirements for the system we're putting in place. On one of the earlier slides that we put up, James had talked about the different levels, and under each one of those levels, we had lots of different applications there. Well, each one of those applications has its own user requirements for those applications. We need to make sure that when we're looking at an application, we're validating that it's installed correctly, we're validating that it's operating the way that it's supposed to be operating, and that it's going to perform the way we think it's going to perform. So putting together user requirements, putting together the scripts that tie back to those requirements, and then generating the trace matrix showing that we've actually tested it against that is so important. Now, in an environment where you're going to have a lot of laboratory equipment, things like that, you may actually have different types of things where you have process validation, and you're looking at a whole different stuff. Right now, we're just talking about computer systems validation for these things, but there's lots of different types of validation across the board. James, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just like to say it's important to understand which systems will need validation and qualification and which don't. Again, back to that idea of keeping it simple and the level of validation and qualification it's needed. You can use a risk-based approach. If you don't have that expertise in-house, reach out to get it. Again, Keith, we don't want to scare folks. So for smaller companies, for the first IND, there are ways to keep this simple, but you need to be aware of it and need to understand which of those things are important for you. Sometimes Excel spreadsheets, people are using those because they have them, but they're starting to use those things, for example, for compliant needs, and it's not the proper tool, and it creates problems later for organizations.
I'll talk about a recent incident that happened to us. We were just on a call recently, working with a company that was out there, and they've been around for a very long time. They're doing an IND, and they're going out, and they've done some clinical trials. And up until this point, they were using their own systems. They had their data. They were having problems finding data. When I first started talking to them, they were talking about that they had lots of data and they were doing stuff, but they really didn't think they needed what we were talking about yet. All of a sudden, they got a call from the FDA. The FDA came in and wanted to see their data. After that initial call with the data, they wanted to call them again, and now they wanted to do the systems where the data was actually stored. All of a sudden, we got a call specifically to say, "Can you help us? Can we put this in a way?" Those are all things that we live and breathe with. So I think those are things. James and I work together on a number of opportunities where we're sitting with the customer. James's knowledge of the actual scientific aspects and our knowledge of the IT portion of that fit hand in glove and enable us to help that client do that risk-based approach that James has been talking about.
Thanks, Keith. Great points. Next slide, Jen.
All right. Let's see. It seems that it seems that everything is moving to the cloud. We are concerned about the security of our data. How can we build a secure and compliant IT environment with a limited IT staff?
So I think that the thing is, can you control the environment? So I think, James, to that point, I think there's lots of things that we do from a perspective of working with hybrid environments, cloud environments, on-premise environments. And some of the things that we think about are public versus private clouds, how we deal with those. Anything can be as secure as you want it or not secure. Just because somebody puts something in the cloud doesn't mean that that cloud vendor is going to be managing it the way you expect them to manage it, because you don't even know what they're doing behind the scenes. For the most part, they're running something. When people log on into an Office 365 environment and they set things up, they get access to email, all of a sudden things are there, but they haven't configured things. They haven't looked at how they're tying their data together. And all of that has to be managed. So you really should work with somebody who understands how to pull that stuff together and how you deal with that. I think from our perspective, we want to look at what are you putting in the cloud? How many different clouds are you working with? Is it a public cloud versus a private cloud? Do you have control over that? How are you tying these things together? How is the data being transferred between? One of the big things people don't realize is that when you transfer data between one system to another, are you looking at how that data is getting transferred? Is it the same data that was sent from one to another? So those are big aspects that we always think about dealing with that, particularly when it's in a multi-cloud environment or multiple vendors on different clouds. James, how about you on your end?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. And what we've spoken to earlier in the webinar is the fact that you need to understand your risks once you start going down the road of using these types of services. I mean, just as an example, it wasn't our industry, but it was in the news recently. The software as a service company that was helping homeowners control their things in their home from an Internet of Things type of perspective. They went out of business and people were blocked out of stuff in their own home. So there's a business risk beyond a compliance risk that needs to be understood and appreciated. So there are ways to control that. Again, we encourage our clients, including our small ones, to start to take those things into consideration before they start going too far out on that branch and understand those risks.
I think one of the big things that when we look at public clouds versus private cloud environments, one of it is what your role is in change control. Do you have an active role in that change control, or is change happening outside of your control? With that being the case, we have to deal a lot with large companies like a Microsoft or an AWS or a Google. When you say, well, what's the big deal with change control? Well, what happens if you have an application that's up and running and all of a sudden that vendor, whether it's AWS or Microsoft, they look at their environment and they're dealing with they're not only dealing with the life science world, they're dealing with all of these other people around the world. And they've got to put out a patch or they've got to put out some change out there. They're dealing with a much larger constituency than you are. So what happens is they're putting it out there. It's up to us as a vendor working with that cloud environment to say, is that change going to affect what we've got? We have ways that we look at, whether it's change records, all those things ahead of time. We look and test before we do things in the public cloud, in the production environment, and we're making sure that it's not affecting us, or we make sure we have enough time to say, hey, when this change comes through, it's going to affect it in this way. We need to fix it ahead of time. So most people running applications don't think that way. So we have to think that way, and your vendor should think that way as well. So if you've got a vendor out there and they're not thinking that way, it's your job to push them to say, hey, what are you doing around these changes that are out there? I'm sure that there's lots of different horror stories, just as James talked about, not being able to get into your own garage or getting into your house with IoT. I'm sure there's lots of people that this thing worked yesterday. Why isn't it working today? And you'll find out that something updated on my laptop or somebody put a new version of a piece of software out there. Everybody at some point has been hit by that, or they've got a new version of their browser and all of a sudden things stopped working. Those are things that we have to take into account on a very regular basis. And it's very important in a regulated environment that you're thinking about those things, or somebody is thinking about that. So that's where that risk is coming in, and that's where we're trying to mitigate that risk for the computing base.
Keith, it's absolutely a big problem, especially for larger pharmaceutical companies right now. They're dealing with, their cloud services changing things, as you mentioned, and then they have to go back, and they now have huge amounts of data in those systems, and they have to go back and revalidate things. But there are ways, even for small companies, to think strategically and try to avoid those problems even now or later, or at least understand those risks and what Keith is talking about. Again, my message is it's not difficult. Just get the people who know what they're doing to help you if you don't have those resources internally.
And I think, James, one of the items that we have on here is configuration versus customization is really important to note. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at systems, particularly if they're going to be in a cloud, that they are configurable. And you've tested around that configuration, because what happens is some people say, well, we don't do it that way. We want to do it this way. So you customize things and you change things for the way you want to run the company. What happens is the more likely you are to use something that's configuration, the more likely you are to deal with any changes that the application can handle. If you customize, what happens is inevitably you may set yourself up for more work in the long run. We've got a partner that we work with that's got an application that's built in one of the major cloud vendors. They put a lot of effort into their automating their scripting. So every time the vendor puts a change out there, they can automatically run their scripts, and it doesn't take them any time to do that. However, many of their customers who are using it in production environments, they've customized it for the way they want to run their business. Well, now what happens is every 2 months, they've got to look at revalidating some of their stuff or running their scripts over again. The vendor of the software, they're geared up to do that. Most customers aren't geared up to do that, and they don't want to do that. They want to run their business. So our goal is to help them to look at how do we set those up so you have the least impact when these changes do happen.
Thanks, Keith.
Anything else, James?
No, I think we can move on to the next slide. That was great overview of some of the issues around that.
All right, thank you. How can we integrate information and data from different sources so that it is easy to find and compliant to future regulatory submissions?
So I think that the major part about this particular question that we put together was just identifying where you are in the process and where the data is coming from and how it's tying together. So this particular framework just looks at all the way from discovery and preclinical through clinical, through data management, regulatory, into manufacturing, all the systems. It goes right along with what we showed earlier in a manufacturing environment where you had all the different levels. Well, in every environment, there's a cycle of how data gets transferred between different systems. So our goal is to figure out, where does that data come from? How do we group it together, and what systems are going to be used to gather that data? So the first thing you really need to look at is you got to solve your problem. So again, each department may find an application specific to that problem. If I'm in clinical operations and I need to get trial master file information, I need to get a TMF. I need to pull that stuff in, and I need to look at how that's tied together to that particular trial. However, when I go to regulatory and I'm going to do a submission to a regulatory authority, I now need to put that into an ECDD format to go to that particular regulatory authority. So I may start to work with a RIM system that may have multiple applications that help me to do that submission. How does data flow from one to another? Can I use drag and drop? Can I maintain links between documents? Those are all simple things that you have to think about when you do stuff. If I'm in the clinical supply chain and I've got a clinical supplier, how am I taking the data that comes from that supplier and incorporating that into my clinical trial management system? So those are all areas that you have to at least scope it out and understand how it all works together when you're doing this work. But if you do that, you can actually stay regulatory compliant, and that's the important part.
Thanks, Keith. My wife was a corporate information specialist, and she had a saying, what's the use of having information if you can't find it? And one of the biggest problems we see is with all this information in different databases and different systems of record, it can be very challenging to find the information you need. So we talked about building some of the hierarchy and business systems that can make that data and information visible to end users, but also in terms of querying it. What I can say is that we have some proprietary solutions that are very powerful that can help companies in terms of finding the information that they need.
Well, I think, James, also to that point, I think if you look at this continuum, one of the things that people think about is when you're in a discovery phase, you want to be really collaborative and you want to share things across different departments and you want to work with stuff. But when you start to get beyond that and you start to get into clinical, you got to start looking at how do we segment that data out and how do we make sure we have control over that data from a perspective of any kind of auditing and things like that. So once we get past that, we did a project with a company that they wanted to maintain that sense of the scientists being able to be very collaborative out there, but they also wanted to know how can we then look at that single source of truth so that as we're tracking that document all along the way, we know where it came from. in their case, it happened to be when finance put a project number on that particular project. So that was that pivot point that we used to say, hey, it's going from this freewheeling discovery type phase into an area now that we're going to have to track it a little bit more closely. So it's simple things like that, that you get the corporate buy-in for that, and everybody understands why they can do certain things in different areas. And whenever you're dealing with a QMS system, most quality departments don't really want anything in their QMS other than their particular documents and what they need to have for that. So it's understanding the mentality and the functionality that you're dealing with for each system that you're trying to put out there as well.
Absolutely, Keith. It's understanding those end users and their requirements. As we all know, scientists don't want to be governed by rules. So sometimes they would get scared by the word governance here. But actually, if brought in properly and structured properly, as you mentioned, it actually enables their job, because they don't want to be frustrated looking for the information they need. They don't want to lose the information they need. They sure as heck don't want to delete it accidentally, right? So these things can enable their science and have them focusing on what they do best, and increase, again, the overall operational efficiency and effectiveness of the organization.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we can go to the next slide.
All right. Question number 6. What is the impact of our technology systems on our quality system now and as we expand to clinical and submissions?
Well, again, I think it's important for small companies to start simple, keep it simple. They don't need a complex QMS system. There are ones out there that can be that are more amenable, I think, to smaller organizations, but you really have to be careful in terms of when and what systems you select there, because it's very difficult once you select one to move to another one. It can be done, but it's just another hurdle or something you have to deal with that you might be able to avoid. Certainly using SharePoint is very common in terms of document management, basic SOPs. We're working with a company now to set up that taxonomy and structure, being able to use the governance around that so that you can do things in a compliant and Alcoa, what we call Alcoa Plus type of method. You want to start with the basics with those types of systems, change control that Keith mentioned, auditing your supplier approvals, deviations, and some simple documentation management and authoring type of SOPs. And as soon as you start generating any kind of GMP, you want a simple training document or SOP around reading and approving, and these systems will advance as you mature. Certainly, as you get to phase 3 and start preparing for PII, that's when you need a very formal quality management system that'll handle all the responsibilities that you'll have as a commercial organization. So you can see as you develop as an organization, it's a ramp. And so as you mature, having that plan in place can really avoid the problems that you've heard Keith and I speak to today.
And I think, James, to that point, I think just understanding that quality is something that you can't take for granted, and that when you put a QMS system in, it may be as simple as the process around quality and making sure you started with that, and understand that you can phase it in. It can be phased in from a paper-based approach. You can have a QMS on paper if you want. The reality is at some point you want to be able to search for that data, use that data, do stuff with that data. By phasing it in the right way as you grow as a company, you can actually incorporate that quality into all your systems across the board. And particularly, I think early on, one of the first things that James talked about was you may be working with other partners. You may be, if you're lucky enough that you get to a great solution and you found that you've got something out there that somebody else wants to work with you on, you may find a big partner out there that comes down and says, hey, we want to fund something, or we want to help you with this. But then they start looking at your systems and you can't find your data, or you can't do something. They're going to take a second look at some of that. They're going to say, well, is it really real? Our goal is to help you from day one to figure out how do we think about that. So putting some of these thoughts in place and just doing some of these simple methods of getting yourself to that point will help you in the long run from a consistency and just a viability perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks, Keith. Well, with that, Jen, I think we're ready. Oh, well, we have some conclusions, and then we'll go to our questions.
Absolutely.
So we've been talking all along about doing a phase appropriate approach, and it starts with keeping it simple. And you're setting the foundation for growth and meeting your regulatory requirements by setting that solid foundation. Take the time now, even if you're a small company, it's not difficult, and it'll pay dividends over and over again later. Keith, I know you wanted to speak to some of these topics. I don't want to steal all the
Oh, yeah, I
thunder.
wanted to make sure that people understood that you can have quality and still be an innovative company. I mean, that company I talked about earlier where they wanted to be able to have that pivot point and be able to do things. We knew that we incorporated some of the quality aspects at that point in the process. Prior to that, they didn't need to worry about some of the different things that we had in place. But once we hit that, then it started to be audit trails and everything else that we needed to do from that point forward. You can build that into your processes as you set up as a company. We talked about best practices, and I think that you as a company have to develop your own best practices. Sometimes you take the industry ones that are there, but you look at how you do things. And I'm going to tell everybody on this call, data silos will always exist. You can't get away from it. It's inevitable, whether it's the smallest company or the very largest one. Your goal is to figure out where they are, but how do we connect them, and how do we make sure that the data is useful from one system to the next as we grow, as we scale the company. You want to get to that enterprise level, all the way from day one to when you finally get out there and do your first get your successful drug launched. The goal is to be able to put those systems in place and know that we can connect data across the spectrum of your environment.
Thanks, Keith. As a small company, if you start out by setting that culture and expectations, people will start to get it, and then they realize the importance of it. And then setting that culture early will pay off dividends, because then everyone understands what you're trying to achieve and the importance of it, and then they'll start working together, as you mentioned, Keith. So great. Thanks, Jen, so much. It's now time for our Q&A session from the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to all of our attendees, and to you, Dr. Blackwell, and to Keith for an excellent webinar. So we have had some questions come in. You can continue to send them through the Q&A on your control panel too, and we'll try to get to them in the time that we have left. So one of the questions that's a really great question, I know probably comes up a lot, is all of our people are consultants and they have their own laptops or computers. Is there something in place that can protect our data? And can you explain how that would work?
Yeah, I think we run into this quite a bit, and the whole concept of mobile device management and how we deal with that. Most consultants don't want a company telling them how to deal with their laptop, or they're going to give them a laptop. Some companies would rather say, okay, we're going to give you a laptop to use on our systems. Some won't, and they'll say you have to use our internal systems, or you have to get into our web-based system. That's a great way of doing it. If they have a centralized system that everybody can get to, and they can do co-authoring or sharing of documents on a centralized system that's out in a cloud environment, that's a great way for the consultants to have their own laptops or their own devices and still be able to get to the corporate data where it can be stored, it can be backed up, it can be used for disaster recovery, and that company doesn't lose out on their data going outside the organization. So those are a number of things that we work with either consulting groups or the sponsors themselves when they're tying in with those different companies.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, Jen, other than we've seen exactly what Keith has talked about. Occasionally, we have clients who do want us to use their laptops for those control purposes. But the cloud-based systems and the securities, for example, that comes with Office 365 are pretty. Microsoft's I think, done a great job of maintaining security and authentication of users on those systems. So. It just depends on the philosophy of the company, I think.
Yeah, and I know, James, that we've got companies that end up going to China on a regular basis, and they have a specific laptop they'll only allow their people to go to China with, because they know that inevitably there might be you worry about data again leaking over there, and that's one of the big things that they worry about.
Yeah, I wouldn't say just China, but yeah, absolutely.
Well, in this day and age, it could be anybody, but exactly. I know that was one area that's a big push.
Super. All right, thank you for that. And we have another great question here, which is one of our early consultants had a lot of information on their laptop, and they've since left the company. How do we prevent that from happening again?
So I guess I'll jump on this one again, James. This is, I think, what I mentioned MDM, the concept of mobile device management. Part of that is making sure that you're backing up data and you've identified which data is going to be for the company and which data is yours and which one is information for the consultant. Being able to have that mobile device management and be able to wipe out your data if somebody were to leave with it, those are key areas that many companies want to worry about, or maybe not, they may not think about it, but they should be thinking about it. We work hand in hand with our companies as they're putting out their devices or working with external partners and understanding how do we deal with that very same situation.
Yeah, I think from a non-technical perspective, that consultant should have been under a CDA. And so there's legal requirements that consultant needs to meet in terms of confidential information. And so I don't know the particulars of this situation, obviously, but I certainly encourage organizations to look at those, their practices in those areas and governance over their consultants and the information that they'll have access to and the expectations for that information and data when they're no longer with the organization.
Well, I can tell you a case in point for a large pharmaceutical company that we work with. They had a consultant who had been with them for years, and he ended up leaving. He was going on to another account, and all of a sudden, we saw anomalous data traffic going from one place to an IP address that happened to be that consultant, and they were pulling down lots of data that didn't belong to them. So there were legal ramifications that happened because of that, but those are things that you have to be on the lookout for. You know, we think about lateral threat detection and different things like that, where we can look for that anomalous traffic. And most of that is a security type of thing that you have to deal with. So those are those things you may or may not think about when you're thinking about putting in an IT system.
And for small companies, their IP is all they have, right? So they weren't really want to protect it.
Okay, and I think we have time to touch on one more question. And this one is, we shared a folder in our file sharing system, and then we found out that someone else had access into data that weren't supposed to. How can we prevent this?
So I think, Jenny, to that one, I think we mentioned a little bit earlier the concept of a governance plan, and James mentioned that people get scared by the word governance. Well, the reality is governance really is around who has access in and who doesn't have access in. How do we protect it? So it's a combination of making it open for the right people and then keeping out the ones that shouldn't get it. Part of the problem is that when people look at a lot of these web-based solutions, they make it very easy to share data, but it's also very easy to protect your data. It's very hard to protect your data at that point. It's easy to share it, but it's hard to protect it. Sometimes you actually send out a link to a folder as opposed to a file. So you wanted that person to share a file, but you shared a folder, and now they have access to all the documents in that folder. We find that quite often because people don't understand how they're using some of the tools that they have available to them. And it's not their job. They're used to being a scientist in an area and dealing with different tools. This is an area where you've got to look how do we lock this kind of stuff down, and how do we most effectively use tools that are available to us.
Super. All right. Well, I think this is going to conclude our webinar for today. If there's any questions that our attendees think of afterwards, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We are going to have a link up of the recording. We will send that out to you. We're also going to have it available on windshire.com and courtsquaregroup.com as well. So we'd like to thank you and again, Dr. Blackwell and Keith for a very informative webinar. Really appreciate your time. Just some housekeeping is that I hope you guys will join us again on June 8th. We have another webinar coming up for PICIA for biopharmaceutical manufacturing. So hope you guys will join us then. This concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, James.
Bye,
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Keith.